When you start paying more for gas than usual, and your wife begins explaining it away with talk of inflation and rising prices at the pump, that's the exact moment when life can shift dramatically. Autumn 2024 brought me more than just colder weather. It brought a coldness that pierced through my soul in ways I never thought possible. I thought I understood sacrifice, commitment, and the weight of keeping promises. I thought I was living a meaningful life, building something real with someone I loved. But that autumn changed everything, and it all started with something as simple as a fuel gauge. My name is David, though my closest friends and family call me Dev. I'm 38 years old, and I've been the director of St. Eucharist Academy in Sacramento for nearly 9 years now. Before I became director, I spent several years teaching English literature to high school students. Those years gave me a deep-seated desire to help young people find themselves in this world, to navigate the complexities of growing up with some guidance. I barely knew my father. He left our family when I was just 3 years old, leaving my mother to raise 3 of us alone. My younger brother Christopher and my sister Valerie grew up alongside me, both of us shaped by our mother's unwavering principles. She was a music teacher, and she used to say something constantly: honesty isn't a choice, it's an obligation. She repeated it so often that it became embedded in my very DNA, part of who I was at the most fundamental level. I met Brittany 5 years ago when she came to our school as a physical therapist. One of our student athletes had suffered a severe knee injury during basketball season, and she came twice a week for rehabilitation sessions. She had that kind of energy that was impossible to ignore, always smiling, genuinely curious about people, radiating life in a way that made people want to be around her. I was 33 then and she was 31. We started dating a few months after she completed the student's therapy, and we got married 2 years later. It was a swift progression, but it felt natural, inevitable even. Neither of us believed in dragging out a good thing. Our first 4 years together were genuinely wonderful. We purchased a modest 2-bedroom condo in the Midtown district of Sacramento, a renovated 1960s unit with large windows overlooking old oak trees. The price was around $420,000, which was a logical investment for a couple earning roughly $160,000 combined annually. I made close to $90,000 from my position at the academy, and Brittany made around $72,000 from her physical therapy practice, where she worked at a clinic downtown. We had regular date nights, traveled to the coast during summers, and spent quiet Sunday mornings reading in our living room. Everything seemed precisely as it should be. But here's what no one tells you about pain and eventual realization: you don't notice catastrophic changes all at once. It's not a sudden explosion. It's not shouting matches or dramatic scenes. It's the accumulation of small, nearly imperceptible details that pile up like condensation on a cold window. First, I noticed that Brittany was spending more time away from home. Her client list, she explained, was expanding. She mentioned that several patients were requesting house calls for their rehabilitation sessions, and that meant driving to different parts of the Sacramento area. I didn't question it. Why would I? We were married. We shared bank accounts. We shared a life. Or so I thought. Then she asked if she could occasionally take my car instead of her own. Her vehicle was making a funny noise, she said, and she wanted to get it serviced. The request seemed perfectly reasonable. I agreed immediately. I had my work vehicle most days anyway, and our household having 2 cars had never been a practical necessity, it was just convenient. She seemed grateful for the offer, kissing me on the cheek before heading out. These were the kinds of small gestures that used to feel so meaningful, so intimate. Looking back now, they take on a completely different significance. But it was in mid-November 2024 when I began to really pay attention. I was sitting at my desk at St. Eucharist Academy, working through end-of-semester budget reports, when I decided to log into our online banking portal. I had always been the detail-oriented partner, the one who tracked expenses carefully. My father had left our family with substantial debt before abandoning us completely, nearly $80,000 worth. My mother spent years paying it off with her teacher's salary, and that experience had permanently shaped how I approached money. I wasn't obsessive about it, but I was definitely conscious. I was the kind of man who reviewed statements monthly, not out of paranoia but out of principle. What I saw that afternoon made my stomach drop. There were hotel charges from the Placerville area. Multiple hotel charges. I'm talking about the Placerville region, that's roughly 70 kilometers northeast of where we lived, just past the Gold Country foothill roads. Brittany never mentioned Placerville. I didn't even know she had patients in that direction. The hotel charges were consistent and recurring. There were restaurant charges too. Laundry services from these hotels. Miscellaneous spa charges. This wasn't 1 or 2 transactions. This was a pattern. Placerville is a historic town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills, famous for its gold rush history and the giant rope noose hanging above Main Street as a morbid tourist attraction. It's about an hour and 15 minutes from Sacramento if traffic is light, longer if you hit the evening rush or if conditions aren't perfect. There was absolutely no reason for Brittany to be spending time there repeatedly. Her physical therapy practice was in downtown Sacramento. Her clients, as far as I knew, were concentrated in the surrounding suburbs: Land Park, Carmichael, Fair Oaks. Never Placerville. I sat there for a long time staring at the screen. My administrative assistant, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on my office door to ask about something related to the winter curriculum, and I had to force myself to smile and engage normally. Inside I was fracturing. But I'm the director of a school. I'm supposed to be composed, professional, reliable. I'm not the kind of person who falls apart based on credit card statements. I needed more information. I needed to know for certain before I let myself believe something this devastating. Around the same time, my brother Christopher, he's a lawyer at a firm downtown, specializing in family law and divorce cases, mentioned something in passing during one of our weekly coffee meetings. Observation is the first tool of recognition, he told me, discussing a case he was working on. We were sitting at our favorite cafe, and he was explaining how he'd caught one of his clients' spouse in contradictions by simply noting inconsistencies in their statements. The comment stuck with me. I realized I needed to observe more carefully. I began documenting Brittany's habits with the precision of someone conducting a research study. I noted when she took my car. I tracked when she left and approximately when she returned. I started paying attention to something that had been nagging at me for weeks: the fuel consumption of my vehicle. She had started asking to use it every 3 days. My car, a 2019 Honda Accord, typically gets around 30 kilometers per liter of gas under normal driving conditions. If she was just driving to therapy sessions 10 kilometers away and then back home, the tank shouldn't be draining the way it was. She was burning through fuel at a rate that suggested she was driving 200 to 300 kilometers per week beyond what her normal job would require. 200 to 300 kilometers. That made sense for regular trips to Placerville. That made horrifying, devastating sense. I found myself in a place I never thought I'd be, a place where I was secretly investigating my own wife. It felt wrong on every level, but the alternative, ignoring the evidence and pretending everything was fine, felt impossible. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Brittany slept beside me, and I tried to reconcile the woman I'd married with the possibility that she was someone completely different than I thought. My sister Valerie has always been perceptive. She works in human resources for a state agency downtown, and she's the kind of person who picks up on subtle emotional cues. One Saturday in late November, she came over for brunch at our place, and she pulled me aside into the kitchen while Brittany was in the shower. "You look terrible," Valerie said bluntly. "What's going on?" I almost told her. My fingers were literally shaking as I poured coffee. But I couldn't articulate it yet. The words didn't exist. How do you tell your sister that you think your marriage is a lie? Instead, I asked her if she'd ever overheard Brittany mention anything about a place called Placerville or about anyone named Christian. Valerie's eyes widened slightly. "Actually," she said slowly, "I was here about 2 weeks ago, and I accidentally heard part of a phone conversation. Brittany was on the phone with someone and she was talking in a voice I'd never heard from her before. She sounded different. Lighter somehow. She said something about, 'When Christian sees this,' and she sounded so happy. Then she caught herself and changed the subject when she realized I was nearby. The name hit me like a physical blow. Christian. Not a medical colleague. Not a patient's family member. A name that suggested something intimate. That evening after Valerie left, I did something I'm not proud of. I contacted a private investigator. I didn't go to the internet for recommendations. I called Eric, my lawyer friend, and asked him discreetly if he could recommend someone trustworthy who did discretionary work. Eric hesitated before giving me a name. I could tell he understood the implications of what I was asking for. There was a long pause after I explained what I needed. "Are you sure about this?" Eric asked me carefully. "Once you go down this road, you can't unknow things." "I need to know for certain," I told him. My voice was steady, even though I felt like my entire internal structure was collapsing. The private investigator's name was Marcus, and he came highly recommended. I met him in a coffee shop, not Temple Coffee Roasters where apparently my wife had met her lover, but a different place downtown. Marcus looked exactly like what you'd expect. Professional, discreet, asking pointed questions that made it clear he'd done this many times before. I paid his retainer, $3,000 that I withdrew from our savings in cash, feeling sick about the secrecy of it all. But I couldn't let Brittany see the financial withdrawal on our statements. Marcus followed Brittany for 2 weeks. That was all it took for him to confirm my worst fears. Detailed reports, time-stamped observations, and even photographs. He documented the pattern. Every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes Saturday afternoons, Brittany would drive to Placerville. She would check into a small motel called the Gold Pan Motel, an aging establishment from the 1970s that had seen better days. She would spend approximately 3 to 4 hours there. She would meet with a man Marcus identified through his research, a man named Christian Valdez, 29 years old, who worked as a personal shopper for a luxury clothing boutique in downtown Sacramento. A personal shopper. Someone whose job was essentially to help wealthy people pick out clothes. My wife was cheating on me with a personal shopper. The absurdity of it would have been almost funny if it wasn't so devastating. According to Marcus's research, Christian and Brittany had met 5 months ago at Temple Coffee Roasters in downtown Sacramento, one of those trendy specialty coffee places that had become popular in the city. They'd struck up a conversation about coffee and recommendations. Marcus had dug into their social media, as much as he could without being obvious, and he found that they'd exchanged contact information and began communicating through text message and a private messaging app. The texts progressed quickly from casual to flirtatious to explicitly intimate. Brittany had apparently told Christian that she was in a loveless marriage, that I didn't understand her, and that she needed to feel alive again. I hadn't even known she felt that way. Apparently, I'd been so focused on my work at the academy, on building programs for the students, on maintaining our household, that I'd completely missed the fact that my wife was unhappy. Or maybe she was always unhappy and I'd just been too blind to see it. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and click like if you enjoy this story. I always read your comments and analyze which stories you like best so that I can create better stories. Thank you. I will continue the story. The realization that I'd been living a lie for 5 months felt like drowning. I spent 3 days processing Marcus's report in secret. I'd read it over and over, photographs in hand, feeling my chest tighten with each review. I kept them in a locked file box that I hid in my office at school, a place where Brittany would never think to look. Each time I reviewed the evidence, I felt another small piece of myself break away. My brother Christopher's first marriage had ended badly, but not because of infidelity. They'd simply grown apart, wanted different things, and decided to separate mutually. He'd handled it with characteristic grace. But my sister Valerie, her first serious relationship had ended when her boyfriend of 3 years had cheated on her with her best friend. That betrayal had done something to Valerie that I could see in her eyes even now, years later. It had made her cautious about love in a way that I recognized. I didn't want to become that, cautious and guarded. But I also wasn't sure how to prevent it now. I scheduled time off work under the pretense of needing to handle personal business. In reality, I spent 2 days at home while Brittany was at her clinic, sitting in our living room trying to figure out how to handle this situation. I considered calling her immediately and confronting her. I considered taking a different approach. I considered leaving before having any conversation at all. But I kept coming back to the same thought. I wanted to know why. Not because an explanation would fix anything, it wouldn't, but because I needed to understand how we'd arrived at this place. On Tuesday evening, I did something I'd planned meticulously. I knew Brittany's schedule. I knew that on Tuesdays she typically arrived home around 6:30 p.m. I prepared dinner, nothing fancy, just some pasta and a simple salad. I made tea. I sat in our kitchen and waited for her to come through the front door. When she arrived, she seemed surprised to see me home. "Hey," she said, setting down her bag and work tablet. "I didn't know you were done early today. This is nice. I'm so tired though. It's been a long day." She came over and kissed my cheek, the gesture so casual, so ordinary that it made my stomach turn. How many times had she given me that same kiss after coming back from Placerville, from him? "Brittany, sit down for a moment," I said quietly. "I need to talk to you about something important." Something in my tone made her pause. She sat down slowly and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out what this might be about. I didn't give her time to construct a story or an excuse. "I know about Christian," I said simply. "I know about Placerville. I know about the hotel. I know about everything." Her face went completely white. For a moment she didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared at me with an expression of pure shock and horror. Then, slowly she started to cry. Not the kind of dramatic, performative crying, genuine tears of someone whose entire world had just imploded. "How?" she whispered. "The how doesn't matter," I replied. "What matters is that it's true. That it's been happening for months. That you've been lying to me every single day." She tried to explain. She said things like she didn't know how it happened, that it just started innocuously and then spiraled. She said that she loved me but that she'd felt disconnected from our marriage. She said that Christian represented something new and exciting, a different version of herself that she'd forgotten about. She said all the things people say when they're caught, and none of it made me feel better. None of it addressed the fundamental fact. She had made deliberate choices, day after day, to betray the person who trusted her completely. "Do you love him?" I asked, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded, how detached I felt. She was silent for a long moment. "No," she finally said. "I don't think I do. I think I loved the idea of him. I loved how he made me feel. But that's different from actually loving him." That answer was somehow more painful than if she'd said yes. Because it meant that she'd thrown away our marriage, risked everything we'd built together, for something that wasn't even real. For a fantasy. For the temporary excitement of feeling young and desirable again. I told her I wanted her to move out. I told her I would be contacting my lawyer. I told her that we were done. She tried to argue, to negotiate, to convince me that we could work through it. But I'd already made my decision the moment I'd seen Marcus's report. I'd been accepting the reality in private for 3 days. Now I just needed to make it official. Eric, my lawyer, was compassionate but businesslike when I called him the next morning. He'd handled enough divorce cases to know the basics, and he explained the California laws to me with clarity. In California, property acquired during marriage is split 50-50 regardless of infidelity. The state is what's called a no-fault divorce state. However, there were some financial irregularities we could address. Brittany had been systematically transferring money from our joint account to cover her expenditures with Christian. Hotels, meals, entertainment. Over the course of 5 months, she transferred approximately $14,000. I had actually anticipated this when I'd moved $30,000 of my own earnings to a separate account at a different bank. I'd done it right after Marcus gave me his report, the moment I'd confirmed my suspicions. It wasn't elegant, but it was necessary. It ensured that at least some of our assets would be protected from a potentially unfair division. Eric advised me to document everything related to the affair and the financial transfers. We filed for divorce in early December 2024. Brittany didn't fight it. She hired her own attorney, a woman named Jennifer Thompson, and while Jennifer did attempt to negotiate on certain points, Brittany herself seemed resigned to the outcome. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. The divorce proceedings moved relatively quickly. The financial settlement ultimately came down to this. We'd each keep our individual earnings. The condo would be sold, with proceeds split equally. I received a $7,000 adjustment to compensate for the financial transfers Brittany had made without my knowledge. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was a recognition that what she'd done was wrong, that there had been financial deception layered on top of emotional betrayal. During this period, neither of us made public statements about what had happened. We told people simply that we'd grown apart and decided to divorce amicably. Our professional circles knew the basic facts but not the details. I appreciated that Eric advised discretion. There was no benefit to airing everything publicly. What I didn't anticipate was what would happen to Christian after the divorce became final in February 2025. Valerie told me something in March, passing along information she'd heard from Cecilia, who was Brittany's best friend and the person who'd initially introduced them to go shopping together for new clothes a couple of years earlier. Apparently, Brittany had been trying to contact Christian after the divorce, but he'd stopped answering her calls and text messages. She'd gone to his workplace to find him, only to learn that he no longer worked there. The boutique said he'd quit suddenly about 3 weeks after the divorce became public knowledge. She'd found an address for him and driven by the apartment he'd been renting. Apparently he'd lived quite close to the Gold Pan Motel in Placerville, which made sense given their regular meetings, and discovered that he'd moved out. Completely. The apartment was empty. Christian had essentially evaporated. His social media accounts were deleted. His phone number was disconnected. It was as if he'd decided that Brittany, now that she was divorced and available, was no longer interesting to him. The chase was over. The excitement was gone. She'd blown up her entire marriage for someone who disappeared the moment the real relationship required actual commitment. I felt a strange mixture of emotions when I learned this. There was satisfaction, certainly. Karma is a real thing, and watching Christian disappear was a form of justice, even if it wasn't something I'd orchestrated. But there was also something more complex. Pity? Not for him, he'd made his choices, but for Brittany. She'd destroyed her marriage for a fantasy, and now that fantasy had dissolved completely. She was left with the wreckage of her own decisions and nothing to show for it except regret and loneliness. The condo sold in late February, and I had enough from my half of the proceeds to put a down payment on a smaller one-bedroom apartment in the same midtown neighborhood. I wanted to stay near my work, near the school, near the community I'd built. The apartment was modest, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I spent a weekend painting the walls, assembling new furniture, creating a space that felt fresh and untainted by everything that had happened in the condo. Christopher and Valerie helped me move. They didn't make judgmental comments about Brittany, but they were noticeably supportive of me. Valerie brought plants for my new place. Christopher brought wine and practical houseware items that I'd forgotten I needed. They ordered pizza, we sat on my bare floor for a while, and we talked about the future instead of dwelling on the past. That was exactly what I needed. I threw myself into my work at St. Eucharist Academy with renewed intensity. The winter semester had ended, and spring was bringing new curriculum initiatives. I'd been planning a STEM education expansion for the academic year ahead, and I decided to accelerate it. I secured grants, coordinated with teachers, and managed the construction of a new learning laboratory. My students noticed the change in me. Several of them mentioned to my office assistant that I seemed more engaged, clearer in my vision for the school's future. The truth was, I'd been forced to examine what actually mattered to me. And it wasn't the marriage or the condo, or any of the material things I'd thought defined my life. What mattered was my work with young people, my relationships with my family, my integrity. Those things couldn't be taken from me by someone else's betrayal. They were mine alone to maintain. By May 2025, nearly 3 months after the final divorce paperwork was signed, life had settled into a new normal. I had regular routines. I went to work. I came home to my quiet apartment. I read books. I spent time with Christopher and Valerie. I called my mother every Sunday. My life was simpler, and in many ways it was fuller. I met someone named Lisa at a community event in early June. She was a history teacher at another high school, intelligent and thoughtful, with a genuine interest in education and community. We talked for almost an hour about literature, travel, and the challenges of motivating students. When she laughed, it wasn't performative or calculated. It was real. By the end of the evening, I had her phone number and we made plans to get coffee. There was no urgency, no desperation. Just a natural progression of two people who enjoyed each other's company. But I didn't rush into anything. I'd learned my lesson about moving too quickly through life, assuming that speed equals commitment. Lisa and I took our time getting to know each other. We went on actual dates. We talked about our lives, our dreams, our past. I was honest about the divorce, about the fact that I'd been betrayed, and instead of seeing it as baggage, Lisa seemed to view it as part of my story, something that had shaped me but didn't define me. As for Brittany, I heard through the grapevine, mostly through Cecilia, who remained friends with both of us, that she'd made some significant changes in her life. She'd left her job at the physical therapy clinic and started a new practice focused on rehabilitation for young athletes, particularly those dealing with sports-related injuries. She seemed to be throwing herself into her work in the same way I'd thrown myself into mine. I didn't know if she was happy. I didn't really think about it much anymore. What I realized over time was that the betrayal wasn't something I needed to overcome through revenge or anger. I'd had opportunities to make Brittany suffer, financial schemes, public exposure, all kinds of things that might have felt satisfying in the moment. But my mother's voice had been in my head the entire time. Honesty isn't a choice, it's an obligation. That obligation extended to how I treated people, even people who'd hurt me. The decision to take the civil, straightforward route through the divorce wasn't about being noble or superior. It was about maintaining my own integrity. When I lay my head down at night, I could look at myself in the mirror and know that I'd handled the worst situation I could imagine with honesty and decency. That was worth more to me than any temporary satisfaction I might have gotten from causing pain. By autumn of 2025, exactly 1 year after I'd first noticed the gas tank gauge, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. My career at St. Eucharist Academy had advanced. I'd been promoted to a higher administrative role within the school's parent organization. The STEM lab had opened to tremendous success, and my students were thriving in ways I couldn't have imagined. Lisa had become an important part of my life. We'd taken a trip up the California coast together, visiting Big Sur and spending time in Santa Barbara. It was peaceful and genuine. I decided to write this account down now, a full year after discovering the truth. Not because I wanted to expose Brittany or shame her, that would serve no purpose. Not because I wanted anyone to feel sympathy for me specifically. Life happens to all of us. We all make mistakes. We all face moments that test who we are. I'm writing this because I learned something important. The biggest tragedies in life often begin with the smallest choices. A choice to grab coffee at a particular cafe. A choice to exchange phone numbers. A choice to take a trip to another town. A choice not to tell the truth the next day or the day after that. None of these choices seemed monumental in the moment. None of them seemed like they would lead anywhere significant. But accumulated over time, they led to the destruction of everything we'd built together. I was tempted, in those dark moments after discovering the affair, to believe that Christian was the villain in this story. That Brittany was either a victim of seduction or simply a bad person. But the truth is more complicated than that. Christian was a person who saw an opportunity for something exciting and took it. He wasn't evil, he was just opportunistic. Brittany was someone who felt unfulfilled in her marriage and made a series of choices to seek fulfillment elsewhere. That doesn't excuse her behavior, but it helps explain it. As for me, I'm someone who believed in honesty and commitment. I'm also someone who made the choice not to respond to betrayal with destruction. That felt important to maintain, even when every part of me wanted to strike back, to make her suffer the way I was suffering. The real question that haunted me even now was whether I could have prevented this. Should I have noticed that Brittany was unhappy? Should I have prioritized our relationship more? Should I have spent less time at work and more time focusing on us? Maybe. Probably. These questions don't have satisfying answers because the truth is that relationships require effort from both people. I made mistakes in that marriage. I was too focused on my career at times. I took Brittany for granted in ways that weren't fair to her. But that doesn't excuse what she did either. That doesn't mean she didn't have options other than cheating. She could have talked to me about feeling disconnected. She could have suggested couples counseling. She could have ended the marriage before starting something with someone else. Instead, she made the choices she made and we both had to live with the consequences. What I know now is that pain has a way of reshaping you if you let it. You can let it harden you, make you cynical and vindictive. Or you can let it teach you something about who you are and what matters. I chose the latter path even when it was difficult, even when it felt impossible. I also know that closure doesn't come from revenge or from seeing your ex-partner suffer. Closure comes from accepting what happened, learning what you can from it, and then choosing to move forward. It comes from maintaining your own integrity even when it would be easier not to. It comes from surrounding yourself with people who love you and support you, like my family did throughout this process. Christopher told me something a few months after the divorce was final. The measure of a person isn't how they handle success. It's how they handle failure and betrayal. You passed that test. I didn't believe him at the time, but I'm starting to understand what he meant. It's not about being perfect or being noble. It's about making the choices that let you sleep at night, that let you face yourself honestly, that let you move forward without carrying bitterness into your future. Thank you for watching this video. YouTube may no longer suggest my channel to you, so subscribe to it to receive new interesting stories. You will also help the channel grow and improve the quality of its content. The screen now displays a playlist with other interesting stories that you can listen to. You can also write in the comments what stories you would like to see on the channel.